made out of cement and sand and soil from different places. So essentially it, in a very tangible way, ends up mapping the places that I've been at. So part of the process is to dig up a bit of the dirt and the soil and the sand of the place that I'm in and include that into a cement and sand mix to create a piece of concrete that I then carve. So it's been a portrait project, looking at the people in my direct line of sight and in my periphery, paying attention to people next to me, around me, in my memory and in my foreground, middle ground, background. And it's a piece that's accumulated over time, that's begun in 2005 and ended yesterday when I made 2 pieces here in Miami. That's one thing. So on a very personal level, it's a way of slowing down, it's a way of being in a place, waiting for the concrete to set, and being able to mark that place. So they're literally little pins that are then reconfigured in a very nonsensical way that alludes to being a map, but isn't, and speaks about individual and collective groupings of people in a couple different ways. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Do you want to just introduce, we'll go see your other sculpture, but she also has 3 large kind of monumental scale sculptures in the other room that we'll come around to, but do you want to introduce them here? And
I think Tobias and Tumelo have done a much better job of putting words to these things than I can do, and so I really resonate with the descriptions that go with these pieces, in that they do the job for me that I can't necessarily do in words, because I've tried to do it in visuals, to connect this very personal endeavor with the political resonances that go with that endeavor. So I'm from South Africa and born in 1971, and so the complexities of South Africa deeply inform this quest, as Tobias was just talking about, that Édouard Glissant talks about, is how do we figure out where we belong? And that's an ever fluid and fluxing situation for me, embedded with legitimacy and illegitimacy. So the bigger pieces over there talk about heroes, power structures, and the collapse of those power structures, and my coming to terms with 3 individual people who have died, and trying to work out my relationship to that and the enormity of that. And so the scale of those pieces speaks to making sense of that, which also speaks to permanence and impermanence and the illusion of solidity, but then it reveals this very fragile, cracked, ruin-like shell. So a lot of contemporary shifting of power structures in South Africa, 20-year-old power structure shifting, and then before that and before that. And so I think the pieces evolve, as do the current and historical politics of places, as we evolve, as you put really beautifully before. So as we evolve, the work evolves, and it kind of morphs and shifts to fit the spaces. And so they look solid, but they're also very modular, and this is also quite a modular.
Any questions for her right now? Yeah.
So each of these spaces are people that you've encountered, or is it from your imagination? Like, are these characters you've invented from your imagination, or are they people that you've actually encountered in the 10 years that it took to find that space?
Both. Oh, it's been 10 years already. Yeah, and pieces have kind of not, this isn't the accumulation of all 10 years. There are some that have made it in and some that have been left behind in places. But from direct observation and from memory, both. Some are very specific, and I think when we were talking to the docents a little bit earlier, I heard myself say that in putting this piece together, and it's different every time, there's so much of a portraiture of my grandmother that comes through, and that's obviously from my memory because she's been gone for a while. But her migratory history is very much a part of this question that will never really be answered as to where I belong and stuff like that. So She's in there, and she is part of my memory, but then actual observation of people are very much in there. So.
Any other questions right now?
Can you talk, how long have you been in Miami as part of this project?
I've been in Miami. When did I get here? On
A week.
Today,
a week, yes.
Yeah, about a week, yeah.
Yeah. And what's your experience of Miami been in the way of
Oh, that's an interesting question.
relating to how you work? I mean, will it more affect what you do
Yeah.
next than what you're showing?
I'll try and make it brief because I could really go on along. There's so many layers to peel of that. So my first encounter to Miami is people, and the way people kind of like molecules form around these creative bodies is just really a very rich and abundant place. The Pérez Museum, as part of Miami, has been an amazing cell to come into, to meet Tobias and to continue working with Tumelo, who I knew before, and to meet the other artists, and we've all been working quite hard. So we've been kind of shoulder to shoulder, but not talking a lot to each other. So to be contextualized by the Poetics of Relation show is my direct entryway into Miami. I got out with my studio assistant yesterday and the day before into Miami, South Beach, and then South, where I did some of the carvings. And it's a really, really interesting place. It's interesting geographically that it connects. I'm living at the moment in Cape Town, so I kept standing on the coastline looking for Cape Town. And so I think that transatlantic voyage for me is something I do very often. And the proximity of this geography being on this side of Florida, and I've never been here before, is really interesting relative to the ocean. So the museum and then the coastline to the ocean. And this kind of lament to like Cape Town, but I'd rather be here, but I don't want to be home, that kind of backwards and forwards. And then it's a complicated place, as a lot of the other work speaks more to, of the show. Tumelo was just talking about the piece around the corner, that there's this kind of stage persona that Miami has, and then there's the grit.
Then there's
The grit.
And so my studio assistant and I decided to catch the bus everywhere so we could see maybe more of the grit. And so one of the portraits is the sand right next to the bus stop. Yeah, and down in the southern part of Key Biscayne. And we were chatting to the people next to us and went to have coffee with some Cubans. So the people are lovely. Miami is a fantastic place if you can slow down. So it's been really nice to be in this incubator, and also really nice to be really hot waiting for the bus. It takes forever on Memorial Day, and getting to know the people next to us on the bus seat. So fantastic place. I like it a lot.
Come back.
Yeah.
Let's go to see Tony. All the artists will be around at the end too. So, Tony Capellán works in Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic, and he's presenting two large-scale installations. This first one, which is a quite iconic piece of his. It's actually from 1996. It's called Mar Caribe, Caribbean Sea. And it's been shown quite a bit in several biennials, and it's owned by the Museum of Modern Art in Santo Domingo. But do you want to, Tony, do you want to speak in Spanish or English?
I can try it in English, but
Okay.
I prefer, of course, to talk in Spanish. Y yo veo muchas caras, salvo ella y eso, yo veo muchas caras que me van a comprender. Lo que no se comprenda, aquí tenemos a Tobias,
Okay.
que me va a ayudar.
Well, let me do a quick introduction and then you add to it,
Okay.
okay? Just very, very quickly, I mean, these are hundreds, ¿cuántos son? Like 500 or like all the... Tony, all of his work is very tied to recuperating trash from the sea and creating large-scale installations from that trash. This early work of his, it's all flip-flops, which are, we think of flip-flops as very... kind of like what we wear to the beach, about leisure. But in a place like Santo Domingo, flip-flops are also the cheapest shoe. It's what the poor wear if they can't afford another shoe. So there's a reference to class here. But also he's putting all these blue and green ones together to evoke the sea, but then each of them have barbed wire on them where you would put your foot. So it's sort of starting to talk about the sea as a barrier, the sea as a, a place of historical violence, those things. But that's my little introduction. But go ahead.
Si quieren preguntarme primero, bien. Si no, yo les digo que Mar Caribe ha sido mi obra, vamos a decir, como que más calado en los diferentes públicos.
It's the piece that's been like most seen of his altogether. Yeah.
No sé si la historia que ella encarna significa lo mismo para todos esos públicos, pero lo que sí sé es que seduce, tiene un magnetismo, algo que hace que la gente entre al significado más que a la forma.
Yeah, there's something about this piece that really draws people in, and it's that draws them into the meaning beyond the form itself.
Es un contenido doloroso, como cuando uno la toca y se pincha. A mí me pasó montándola que
It has a kind of a painful or violent side to the piece, yeah.
Pero creo que es un contenido verdadero.
But it has a truth to it. The content has a truth to it.
Y quizá eso es lo que ha podido sobrevivir de una obra que la hice por primera vez en 96 para una exposición en el Museo de Arte Moderno y que luego ha podido presentarse en muchos contextos con mucha discusión y con mucha, vamos a decir, afectación.
He's saying it's been amazing for him to live from a piece of this kind that's been shown so many times and created so many different types of discussion.
Hay algo individual y algo colectivo.
There's something individual and something collective in this piece. And I think it's an interesting dialogue with Ledelle's work as well. It's a nice dialogue how sort of when I was talking about how we can be one and multiple in our identities, or this sense of the individual in the multitude. It's one of the themes that goes throughout the show and in both these works.
En esta ocasión, una de las satisfacciones más grandes que tengo antes de presentarla al público es el diálogo que he podido lograr con estas obras, que me ha parecido una cosa maravillosa poder encontrar una artista de Sudáfrica con la cual dialogar de cosas parecidas y cosas a la vez muy diferentes.
That it's exciting. One of the things about the show is sort of being able to have these dialogues between sort of for example, artists from South Africa and artists from Dominican Republic, and find a similar language or similar questions. Yeah.
Bueno, para mí que he recogido esta, nosotros le llamamos de muchas maneras, sandalias, calipso. Nadie puede creer que le llamamos calipso, pero
there are many different names for the flip-flops. Yeah.
¿De dónde vino la idea de usar los flip-flops?
Bueno, la playa, Santo Domingo está cruzada por un gran río, el río Sama, y en las márgenes de ese río vive mucha gente que no tiene otra opción en la vida que más que vivir ahí, ¿verdad? Cuando crecen las aguas, se los lleva todo, se lleva sus zapatos, todas sus cosas. En la otra pieza, Mar Invadido, se ve aún más patente lo que le estoy contando. Y se lleva sus zapatos también, sus sandalias. Y parece que este es el color preferido porque no son solamente de hombres, también mujeres, niños, todo. Y al parecer es el color preferido, por eso yo pude encontrar tantas. Y puedo seguir encontrándola, podría seguir haciendo más grande. Y de hecho, a veces la he tenido que agrandar para ciertos espacios.
Let me just translate a little bit. He's saying, much of his work responds to this particular phenomenon. There's a neighborhood in Santo Domingo, like a very poor neighborhood, kind of like a shantytown, a favela a whole neighborhood that's built on the sides of the Osama River that flows into the port, and it's a very precarious place to live because multiple times during the year this neighborhood floods, and everyone who lives there, all of their belongings are washed into the sea and actually end up on another side of the island. And he was mentioning the other work that he's presenting shows more diversity of materials that he finds on the beach. But here, he's focusing just on the sandals, and he was saying that actually it's unusual that like the most preferred color of these sandals seem to be blue and aquas and things like that. So.
¿Quieren preguntarme algo?
Anybody have any questions?
Could you talk a little more about the dark side that comes from the barbed wire?
I think the show, the meaning of the show is historical and basic. And slavery, it was very strong in Caribbean. And this heritage is vigente. I don't know in English.
It's alive history, meaning the history of slavery is
With
very
changes,
present.
but the history is similar. And these people living around and in the river is an example of the consequence of the slavery. Pero, lo voy a decir en español,
Ya, está
me
bien.
canso mucho, después termino mal. Pero lo interesante es la visión contemporánea del asunto, a mi manera de ver.
What's interesting is the contemporary view on the situation.
Que si nos quedamos en el pasado, podríamos encontrar muchos argumentos, tanto visuales como teóricos, pero no es el pasado lo que nos toca a nosotros, es el presente.
Like if we look to the past, we can find many examples and or illustrations. But what matters is what we're living now, or living in the contemporary moment, and how it affects us.
Y yo he encontrado esta manera de poder decir estas cosas y que las audiencias las acepten, las piensen, las reelaboren y luego me devuelvan muchísimos sentimientos y gratitud y cosas bonitas que se recibe cuando uno hace una obra como esta que tiene vigencia para tanto en diversos ambientes, en diversas realidades, con diversas culturas.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of what he receives from doing this, like the kind of dialogue that it creates. Yeah. What else did you say? I missed something.
No.
Yo, Pedro, no.
Okay. Tendremos otra oportunidad de hablar
Yeah, we'll see another piece by his, but let's move on to the next works, and we can ask questions as well. So we're walking by two video rooms that we won't go into, but those two videos and these two works here are by the same artist named Ito Barada, and she works in between New York and Tangier. She's from Tangier, Morocco, and her work is really centered around sort of the history of Tangier, her own relationship to the city and to the kind of the legacies of the French in Morocco, like her own family kind of growing up, and one of the films we're showing is sort of talking about her own family, but using tourist footage from the 50s and 60s, kind of showing Morocco as this exotic locale. A lot of her work, her previous work, or what informed her early work, was, Tangier is one of the places where a lot of people in Morocco go to try to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. And so it's a site similar to Miami, in the sense of, Haitians and Cubans trying to cross to Miami. It's a similar site, on the other side of the world, in a European context. This piece in particular is called A Modest Proposal, and it's a series that kind of reference street posters, but it collages together a lot of her various interests, including family photos, images mapping of the city of Tangier, images of kind of urban development of the city of Tangier right now. Tangier as this site where people kind of wait to try to leave to go to Europe, but now the borders are much more closed, and there's a lot of European investment trying to turn Tangier into sort of a European tourist, kind of destination, and a lot of her work references that. So, she has this great phrase, "I'm not exotic, I'm exhausted." So sort of talking about, this desire to turn her home into an exotic location for Europeans, and all of the class questions and the labor questions involved in those dynamics. Here, like these palm trees, she's referencing with these, kind of they look like old announcements for a hotel, or she's specifically referencing movie signs as well. She in Tangier, she started a project called Cinema Tangiers, where she and a bunch of artists took over an old movie theater and show avant-garde films. So the reference to film is part of her practice in general. But here, sort of the light bulbs, some of them are intentionally out. It's sort of evoking something that's sort of a past moment. many films in the past, in the 50s, 40s and 50s, were filmed in Morocco or Northern Africa, trying to show it, think of Casablanca, think of this legacy of film being used to exoticize this part of the world. But she's also talking about the landscape and how the palm tree is this sort of cliche image of like the ultimate tourist destination. Of course, that has a lot of resonances for us in Miami. We're always selling palm trees. But the palm tree in Morocco is not indigenous to the landscape. That's why she's kind of referencing it's like a toy, on these carts. It's moved around. She's talking about urban development as well. How when different urban plannings or different government leaders in a particular moment will suddenly create boulevards and plant tons of trees. If a diplomat is coming or something, they might rearrange the city as a child might rearrange their blocks in a way. So she's referencing those kind of dynamics that are happening right away as we speak in Morocco as well. She's not with us. She's in New York. She's between New York and Morocco, but I can answer any particular questions about her work. Or we can keep moving. Just briefly, Ervin Anderson. We have 5 paintings by Ervin Anderson. Ervin Anderson is an artist working in London. He was born in London, but his family is from Jamaica. He was the last of 7 brothers and sisters, and everyone else was born in Jamaica, but he was born in London. And a lot of his work is interested in, he always works in landscape. He's looking at a history of kind of British landscape. When we think of there's a grand painting tradition of landscape in England, but he's mixing that landscape with a tropical landscape, a Caribbean landscape. And he's creating these kind of memory images, these spaces that he hasn't lived in, but that are a part of his own family's history, his own, like family mythology, but also again referencing, kind of echoing colonial histories. Hope Gardens over there is a botanical garden in Jamaica that is kind of modeled after the Kensington Gardens in London. And its title, Hope Gardens, this very aspirational thing, but actually sort of he's using it to reference this kind of colonial history. Talking about places of kind of these tennis court, sort of this empty tennis court, referencing sort of a moment, a space of leisure, but with this barbed, this chicken wire over it, sort of presenting a space of inclusions, talking about sort of class divisions, within Jamaica and these kind of tourist economies as well. This is a painting called Imperial. It's referencing like a private club, like a private traditionally white club in Jamaica, sort of the title Imperial, directly referencing sort of the empire, British Empire, and how that sort of kind of melting away, the way he's painting, it's sort of dripping away. But he's looking at these sites from a contemporary perspective. How do you process these? How do you think about these legacies? How do you interpret them, in a contemporary moment? And how does he think about them as someone who, did not grow up with these, but it's part of his own past, his own family's history? And how does he sort of wrestle with those legacies today? So let's keep going in Ledelle. Maybe we'll do Xaviera first. This is Siberia Simmons. She's the artist who created this new commission and these photographs on the other side. So if we can gather together, because there's another group, and if we don't stick together, you can't hear us. So, Xaviera, can you introduce these pieces for us? This is press.
Hi, press. So I'm Siberia Simmons, and this is The Lushness Of, and this is Super Unknown. Super Unknown was produced in 2010. It's a series of, I'm sorry, I just spoke to these people, so I'm a little frazzled, so give me 2 seconds. Okay, Super Unknown was produced in 2010, and I made it. I'm traditionally a straight traditional photographer. I studied with Stephen Shore and really influenced by the German photographers of the early 2000s, like Thomas Ruf. And I wanted to. I was always working with this very traditional film camera, and I wanted to think about how to make a digital image. Like, so this is in 2010, and I wanted to think about how a modern photograph was produced, and that's how I started making this work. Was thinking about how an artist collects and how a modern photograph is made. So out of that thinking came me collecting JPEGs and images, and this is a set of the images that I started to collect. And I think simultaneously, while I was thinking about photography and how to make a modern photograph, I also listened to a newscast that was someone had found either a note in a bottle or some debris from one of the ships that had sunk or where people had perished. And it was one from Haiti to America, and it said, or the United States, and one of the notes said, "Please excuse me and goodbye." And so I started thinking of this one gentleman had written this note to his family, kind of embarrassed that he had taken this journey and knew he was going to die. So I sort of started thinking about that, and then obviously thinking about migration and how to think about the journalist who was obviously above looking at these images. So these people were actually not alone, because they were documented. And then also thinking of the ocean as a space of conflict, it has like a romantic feeling, but it also has a very conflictual feeling. And I'll just go back a little bit in my own personal biography, in that I spent 2 years on a walking pilgrimage retracing the transatlantic slave trade from the United States to West and South Africa. So that's had a huge influence on how I look at parcels of land, because when you walk for 8 hours a day for 2 years, you sort of start to think of what's underneath each little section that you're working with, and especially when you're walking in meditation and with monks and with intention. And so for me, this collection is, while it is about what is inside of the image, which is migration, it's also about thinking of each parcel of space inside of the ocean and what could possibly be the history, language, culture, catastrophe of like each parcel of ocean that we sort of romanticize and enjoy, as well as travel through on a regular basis. That's the short story of it. If you have any other questions, just let me know.
And then this one.
And then, yeah. And then, so this is a piece called The Lushness Of, and I started collecting when Tobias and Tumelo asked me to be a part of this show. I started really thinking about how to build a landscape with language, and also how to, I was talking to Zarina, whose work I'm like obsessed with right now, thinking about, language as cinema, and the build up, how to make a sort of photographic or cinematic experience with language. And so that's sort of how I came to this type of work. But I started making these types of work because I was thinking a lot about street signage and the universal street language and street signs, and how words like pear, peaches for sale, I mean, that's one way of thinking of paint on wood. But then you can take it much further and think a lot about the poetics of street signage and street language. And so that's sort of how I started producing these works. And this piece in particular is a buildup of a landscape, and also a buildup of a multilingual character's experience of memory and landscape. So this piece is in Spanish, French, Spanish, Haitian Creole, and English. And characters experience between space and how they kind of go in and out of landscape and how they go in and out of their memory of landscape or space or it starts off with a more like blue kind of feeling on the top, and then in the middle there's a lot more about borders and repetition, and then sort of towards the third quarter is more about the moon and a relationship with the moon, and then the last quarter really has more of a sort of earth, like on the ground. There's references to wood and sand and coasts and the ocean, but it's kind of more on the ground. So, and there's also sort of a feeling of day to night, to dusk, to dawn, and there's also a lot of repetition that I have with certain languages that's throughout all of my text pieces. Like there's certain words that continuously come up in all of my text pieces, like musk. I'm really interested in fragrances and how when we read about fragrance or fragrance notes, like how that resonates in our mind and our memories of landscape, of space, of place. That's the long short of it.
Any questions for
As you were composing this, were you visualizing it simultaneously as something that sort of would read as a text, as though it were in a book, and as, well, this almost a landscape that's so big?
Yeah, I don't think of it ever in terms of as a book. I definitely think of it in terms of a photograph or film. I don't, because it's hard to describe, but I think when I'm making this work, which is very intentional, I was telling the other docents that I'm a pretty like tightly wound artist, you know, like I'm very like, I control everything, like I'm not very loose. So this work is actually a collection, you know, I collect the phrases and I kind of sculpt the language to work together. And in this case, it's in 3 languages, so I had to really work to sculpt and control how the language was going to flow, you know, and have a bit of freedom. So what was your question?
Well, can it be read as a
It should be read.
an abstraction?
I would love if someone, you know, if people would spend time with it as they would looking at a film, as they would looking at a sculpture or painting that they were really intrigued by. I think that's the only way to get, the only way I can describe how I feel about it is like there's your back and there's your front, and then there's a space in between. And I'm really interested in how the words and language resonate in the space in between your back and your front, and the air that's between the back and the front, and the synapses that fire as you're looking at each image and thinking, you know, everyone has a relationship to certain, like wood, like, you know, sandalwood, juniper, fir, musk. Like we all have this sort of like, you know you have a memory somewhere there, and that's the patience that I would love for people to have when they're reading and looking at this work, is letting all of the language sort of fall into itself constantly, and then when it falls into itself, it resonates inside of you, and you think about that space between the back and the front, and how you breathe, and how mahogany comes into your mind as you're reading this, and then how blue and the repetition of the word blue and how that comes into your mind, and sort of what that means to you, what that means in reference to the rest of the works in this room, and then also in particular to the flow of the language, and how the color blue and the color and the idea of sandalwood, and then the idea of juniper, how those come together, and what memories you can evoke inside of yourself from that. So that's sort of the long answer. Yes.
As you were writing the words, as you were actually painting them, did you ever start over? Like, did you?
Not once.
You know what I mean? Like, or did you just do it stream?
I don't do a stream. I actually have a script. Again, like I said, I'm pretty controlled in my work. Like even in my photographs, I plan pretty much everything out. So I have a to call it a script or a score that I work with, but in that, there's certain, especially because I'm working with these 3 languages, I had to have I had to give myself a little more breath, a little more freedom with it. So there were times where, you know, there's a phrase, I don't know, in desire for and by nature of mass, now towards the midnight of colors. Like I needed to think, okay, now towards the midnight of colors, like, okay, where can I really want that to, I really want to hear that in Creole. Like how does that sound? Like where can I fit that in? So I had to be a little looser than I normally am with how I brought it together, even though I had a spine, a structure. So for the most part, I would say I probably changed 2-3 times in terms of, oh no, this line doesn't work. And I think it was twice. It was one line down there that I left, and I remember Tobias came and he was like, what happened, you know? And like I had shifted the language because as I read it, it didn't like the idea of the golden fragrant moon. Like that didn't work for the rest of the text. And I think probably there was like a line at the bottom, sort of the end that I shifted. But for the most part,
Do you concern yourself with the sound of the language?
oh my God. Well, I live with a beautiful, my partner, he speaks like 4 languages, so I'm obsessed with like, I'm always, you know, if we fight, I'm like, speak to me in Spanish because I don't like you in English, you know, so I'm really, or speak to me in Italian, you know, and it really changes each language. You know, anybody who speaks multiple languages is like, you're a different, we were talking about this, you're a different person. Like when you're speaking in Italian, it's like, my boyfriend, when he's speaking Italian, he's all like this. But then when he speaks in French, I swear to God, he's like, this like tight little like French person, you know? So I think a lot about that in this piece. You know, Spanish, I hear it so much in my home, so it has a certain resonance and feeling for me. And then Creole has another rhythm. Yeah, so yeah, the rhythm is all.
Let me introduce Tumelo Mosaka. He is the co-curator of the show. He was finishing for us a tour, so welcome Tumelo.
Thank you.
So, I don't know if you want to say anything about the show. I mean, we introduced it, but we're just moving along.
Oh. I mean, I think it's been a process which I think Tobias and I think the title of it being Poetic Relations has also to do with our relationship as, you know, we've known each other a long time, but also I think have worked in different spaces. And so the body of artists that we brought together sort of reflect a complexity of ideas and an interest of ours that I think goes way back. You know, at least from when I first arrived in the United States and thinking about what it means to be in a different space, what it means to have new encounters, what it means to think about you know, your personal identity. What does it mean to think about relationships between places? And so I think it's definitely been a journey for us as curators, but as well as having very different conversations with each individual artist and thinking about the relationships of the work and how they echo each other and have a sort of a very different take, and yet at the same time really connect in terms of their similar concepts or ideas.
So it's sort of the notion of like Glissant's ideas about relation are what we always do as curators, right? We bring works together and see what happens, you know, how they interpret each other, how they respond to each other. And so it's a little bit embedded in his thinking is the way we think as curators. And there are always experiments, and, you know, a work of art always means something different depending on where it's seen and what it's seen next to, and, you know, the conversation that it's placed into, and I think that's the same of ourselves as people, right? So, and that's kind of the thematics in the show. I know we don't have tons more time, so I wanted to take everyone. This is Zarina Bjimji, who is the fourth artist who's with us for the opening, and we'd like to look. She has 2 films in 2 separate rooms, but we're going to look at just for a few minutes to get a sense of her vocabulary, her Jangbar film, which she just finished, and so we're very excited to be showing it here. And why don't we go in and just look at it for just a few minutes, and then come out to speak with her. As I mentioned before, this is Zarina Bjimji. We're showing 2 films. In the other space is a film from 2011 called Yellow Patch, and this film is just finished, and literally, she just finished the color and the sound and rushed it here. So it's from this year called Jang Bar. But maybe you could introduce the project or both projects.
Jangbar was shot last year. It took quite a while to get it shot because of the problems in Kenya. It was shot in Kenya, northern Kenya, the landscape, and Uganda Railway, which is about 500 miles from Mombasa, which is one part, sorry, my geography is not that good, and the other part is Kisumu, which is near the border of Uganda. So basically, and then there are churches as well. I tend to the work started looking at questions of why did Indians end up in Africa? But as the questions developed, it no longer is about that, but more about, it's become much more abstract. It's much more about observations, spaces, moments of light. So basically, I'm struggling today, sorry, big jet lag. Basically, it's shot on film, and that's really important as well. It's shot on 35mm, and the texture and the quality of film has a painterly quality. The way I like film to be installed is to have a border, so that it feels like it's floating in the space. And the scale, the fact that it's shot on 35mm, you can work with scale. The relationship of a chair or an object and how you connect with it is very important, but also the way it unravels and opens up like a piece of thread and it falls on the floor and makes a sound. So in a way, when I was editing, I was thinking about it in that way because I didn't know what was going to be the beginning or the end, but I stitched it each day as we went along. We have some technical problems, so that's the sound you're hearing. It's not from the film. So basically, I shoot the film, and then I look at the brushes, and then I edit it. And this time, as I said, I didn't know the beginning and the end, but it became very interesting working like that. Usually I'm quite controlled and I want to know, I have a timetable and sound script. But this time, because we didn't have all the locations, I decided to flow with it. But it was much nicer way of working because I developed the rhythm and the patterning. So once the film is edited, mute, I edit it mute. I like to, because I trained as a photographer, I like to work with image, and I need to know that the image is working by itself, so that if you saw it silent, it still flow. And then once once the picture is edited, I want the sound. And
You're mixing lots of different some of it's like recorded footage, some of it's created, some of it's environmental.
yeah, we found a lot of, because this time we didn't record the sound, we found a lot of them on the internet. For example, the bit that you saw, it came from a documentary of when Tumelo died, and they kept his body in state for a while, and there were women coming out and crying. So we couldn't find the right crying sound on the internet. I wanted it to feel real. I wanted it to feel intimate, so that you could feel that yourself, what that grief might be. And then we found other sounds from the documentaries as well. So,
I mean, one thing, I think you mentioned, both these films, there's a third film as well, Waiting, but they were conceived as one film altogether, like one research project that is finally coming to completion with this third edition. So there's a lot of interaction and a lot of visual kind of dialogue between them, but it's the same kind of body of research that she's working with.
Originally, all the film was going to be called Yellow Patch, and Yellow Patch was inspired by a lecture I went to by Doris Lessing, and she talks about Marcel Proust. And I was looking back home, and I thought, I can call it Yellow Patch because it's a very painful way of being able to describe India and Africa, because they're both the sons in a way belong to me. And so, and in fact, the title Yellow Patch was, I thought about it quite a lot, and it was in a way a structure that led me to think more about how to shoot the film, because how to put bits of yellow color on it, and patch it, and so, but also the sun, the color of the sun, because in Yellow Patch film we used a lot of pink evening light, and in a way that I like that because it felt like grief but tenderness at the same time. So the coloring and the light is really important. And the other thing in this film, which is a new development, is that I started working with Swahili words, and when you were talking, I was beginning to. I've just been really fascinated because I wanted to hear, like for example, Mohindi is an African word for Indian, but also Kikuyu people use it to refer to cunt, female. So I wanted to explore those tensions or bring some other things by saying Swahili colonialism or landscape, and then words like beauty, girl, boy, love, hate. So there are about 12 words that I strung them together in New York in a hotel, and somehow that was it. It was fixed. This happened about 3 years ago. But it became, the Swahili became something else. It's become, the words have become object for me. And I wanted to stretch them out or squeeze them in to experience the language in a different way and play with it. So I think,
Those words spoken
the spoken,
or visual representation?
then Yellow Patch. I've been interested in, again, same as Wiley, I've been interested in Western classical music as well, and I've been wanting to work with that, and also a little bit of, I've been researching African music that didn't find its way, like this jazz music in colonial time, independence music, African music, but somehow it's not found its way here yet. But I think it's each time I make a work, something new comes up, and then later, because if you make it here, I have to think about it. I didn't know that African jazz existed.
Any other questions?
Well, in the brief segment that we reviewed, how long is this?
27 minutes long, and the other one is 25, I can't be, about 25, 27 minutes.
There's a fairly tight focus here, and in some cases very close kind of examination of surfaces. Is the entirety of it quite compressed, or are there broader vistas as well as
the landscape wide angle lens, so it's quite open. But the idea of that you see, I use macro lens as well, so you can see, hair on your, that you probably, and cobwebs. You don't see hair, but I'm interested in cobwebs because I was talking earlier about space. Space really interests me, and how you can take a lens and enlarge it and put it in a space and do something else with it, and that scale and spacing. But also, when I first started thinking about photography, I liked the classical language of Leica cameras, and it really, or Rothko painting, like in Out of Blue, I have bits of things that look like Rothko and birds flying, and I thought, finally I brought painting and Africa together. So, just running.
What if, I know we're sort of over time, so why don't we just give you guys a chance to speak to us individually. Ledelle is here, these are her other pieces. Tony has another installation on the other side here, and Siberia is here, so we'll all be here and you can speak to us individually and enjoy the show. We're all really excited. And tomorrow evening, the four artists who are here, and Tumelo and I are having a discussion together at 7 o'clock, so if you'd like to join us, please invite friends